Hey everyone, this is Paul. Before we jump into today's story, I want to talk to you about where we're headed next. So, today, we're starting something completely different. A three-part series I'm calling The Ethiopian Exception. And I want to tell you why the story grabbed me by the throat and wouldn't let go. Picture this. It's the 1890s, and European powers are basically treating Africa like a board game. They're literally sitting in Berlin, drawing lines on a map, dividing up an entire continent over coffee and cigars. The whole thing feels inevitable, right? Superior technology, better organization, all that colonial machinery just rolling forward. Except, there's this one place where everything goes spectacularly wrong for the Europeans. On March 1st of 1896, in the mountains of northern Ethiopia. And I'm sure you've never heard of this battle. An African emperor named Menelik II doesn't just beat the Italian army, he absolutely destroys them. We're talking about one of the most loop-sided military defeats in modern history. But here's the thing, and this is why it's perfect for our show. That single day created this psychological DNA that still runs through Ethiopia today. When you see Ethiopia's fierce independence, their refusal to bow to outside pressure, even their role in founding the African Union, it all traces back to that moment when they proved European armies weren't invincible. We're going to dig into how one battle became a century of defiance, how military victory became national character, and how Ethiopia carved out this completely unique path through the colonial era. Before we dive in, though, quick favor. If you're loving the show, or even if you're not, just hit us up at doublehelixhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Tell us what you want to hear more of, what's working, what isn't working. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, or X, whatever we're calling it now, and on BlueSky. And if you've got a spare minute, ratings and reviews genuinely help other people find the show. All right. Let's head back to 1896, to a mountain battlefield, where an emperor who understood that wars are won in the minds before they're won with swords was about to change everything. Adwa, northern Ethiopia, March 1st, 1896, 5:30 a.m. The sound you're hearing is silence, not peaceful silence. This is the kind of silence that settles over a battlefield just before everything explodes. If you were standing on these rocky slopes, 8,000 feet above sea level, you'd see your breath crystallizing in the thin mountain air. The temperature hovers just above freezing, and the red mountains claw at the sky that's about to witness one of the most consequential battles in modern history. Down in the valley, 17,000 Italian soldiers are stirring in their camp, eating coffee over small fires, checking their Mauser rifles one more time. They've been marching through this alien landscape for days. These endless plateaus where every rock formation looks like a fortress. These mountains that seem designed to swallow armies whole. They're tired, disoriented, and most of them are about to die on foreign soil they can barely pronounce. But here's what they can't see from their position in the valley. All around them, hidden in every crevice, behind every boulder, in every fold of the mountain terrain, are 100,000 Ethiopian warriors. Not soldiers in the European sense, warriors. Men who know these mountains like the scars on their hands, been moving through this landscape like ghosts for weeks, who understand that they're not just fighting for their emperor, they're fighting for the right of Africans to remain free. Emperor Menelik II is watching all of this unfold from his command position on the heights above Adwa. He's 52 years old, wearing traditional Ethiopian robes, but with a European military telescope in his hands. Perfect symbol of what he represents. He's been planning this moment for years, and he understands something that the Italian general, Oreste Baratieri, fundamentally does not. This is not just a battle. This is the moment when Africa either bows to Europe forever or stands up and says, no. This is part one of the Ethiopian exception. One day in Adwa. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. To understand what happened at Adwa, you have to understand what wasn't supposed to happen. By 1896, the European colonization of Africa was rolling forward with mechanical certainty. The Berlin Conference of 1884 had carved out the continent among European powers like slicing a wedding cake. Neat, efficient, and completely ignoring the people who actually lived there. We are in Berlin, in the German Empire, on November 15th of 1884. We're in a smoking room that reeks of expensive cigars and imperial ambition, where 13 European nations and the United States have gathered to decide Africa's fate. No African was invited to this particular dinner party. Otto von Bismarck presides over this colonial carve-up with methodical precision. The French get West Africa. The British control of the coast and the Nile. The Germans carve out their slice of East Africa. The Portuguese hold their ancient trading post. And there, almost as an afterthought, the Italians. Late to arrive, desperate to prove they belong at this table of imperial powers. But notice what's missing from their maps. A massive blank space in the Horn of Africa labeled simply Abyssinia. Ancient, Christian, mountainous, and stubbornly independent. The Italians look at that empty space and see opportunity. They have no idea they're looking at their future graveyard. Emperor Menelik II, born Saleh Mariam in 1844, was not what European colonial theories expected from an African ruler. This is crucial to understand. The Europeans had spent decades constructing elaborate intellectual frameworks to justify why African societies couldn't resist European expansion. Africans were supposed to be too primitive, too disorganized, too technologically backwards to mount effective resistance against modern European military power. But Menelik had spent his youth as a political hostage of Emperor Tewodros II, and that formative experience taught him something that would prove devastating to European assumptions. Knowledge was power, and power could be learned. While other Ethiopian nobles focused on traditional warfare and core intrigue, Menelik was studying European military technology, political organization, diplomatic strategy. He read French and Italian newspapers when he could get them. He interrogated European travelers about their country's military capabilities with the systematic curiosity of someone who understood that information was the difference between independence and colonization. When he became emperor in 1889, Menelik inherited what looked like the kind of internally divided African kingdom that Europeans had been conquering with depressing regularity. Ethiopia was less a modern state than a collection of competing kingdoms. The Tigrayans in the north, the Oromos in the south, the Amharas in the central highlands, each with their own armies, languages, and thousand-year-old grievances. It was exactly the kind of internal division that Europeans had exploited everywhere else in Africa. But Menelik saw something his predecessors had missed. The European threat was existential enough to force unity. For the first time in Ethiopian history, the choice wasn't between different versions of Ethiopian rule, it was between Ethiopian independence and European colonization. The crisis that led to Adwa began with a treaty that meant different things to different people. In 1889, Menelik signed the Treaty of Wuchale with the Italians. In the Amharic version, it said Ethiopia could use Italy as an intermediary in international affairs if it chose to. In the Italian version, it said Ethiopia would conduct all foreign relations through Italy, making it essentially an Italian protectorate. In Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on February 12 of 1893, Menelik discovers the linguistic sleight of hand 4 years later. But he didn't just denounce the treaty and storm off in imperial fury. That's what the Italians expected. The kind of dramatic but ultimately ineffective gesture that allowed Europeans to portray African leaders as emotional and unstable. Instead, Menelik began preparing for war with the methodical patience of someone who understood you'd only get one chance to get this right. And this is where Menelik's genius becomes clear. He understood that the Italian strategy was based on assumptions that had worked everywhere else in Africa, but that those assumptions weren't natural laws. They were patterns that could be broken. First, he set about building the largest indigenous army Africa had ever seen. This wasn't just about numbers. It was about psychology. Ethiopian unity couldn't be imposed through traditional imperial dominance. It had to be forged in the fire of shared existential threat. Menelik traveled personally to every major province, not as a conquering emperor demanding tribute, but as a fellow Ethiopian facing foreign invasion. In Tigray, where Ras Mengesha had been flirting with Italian alliance, Menelik reframed the choice. This wasn't about regional autonomy versus imperial control anymore. This was about African independence versus European colonization. The psychological complexity of what he accomplished cannot be overstated. These were kingdoms that had been fighting each other for centuries. But Menelik was proposing something unprecedented: continental solidarity in the face of European aggression. Second, he played European powers against each other with sophisticated cunning. While preparing to fight the Italians, he bought arms from the French and the Russians. He exploited Ethiopia's ancient trade routes to accumulate modern rifles, an estimated 100,000 by 1896, which was more than most European armies possessed. But the psychological dimension of Menelik's strategy was even more sophisticated than the military logistics. Every Ethiopian warrior who marched towards Adwa carried with them the understanding that they weren't just fighting for their emperor, they were fighting for the principle that Africans had the right to govern themselves. Meanwhile, Italian General Oreste Baratieri was trapped between contradictory pressures. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi in Rome wanted a quick, decisive victory to prove Italy's imperial credentials. But Baratieri, who actually understood the military situation on the ground, knew his forces were outnumbered, operating in impossible terrain and facing an enemy they had consistently underestimated. The exchanges between Rome and Eritrea in the weeks before Adwa read like a slow-motion disaster. Crispy demanding immediate action, Baratieri explaining why immediate action would be military suicide, Rome threatening to replace Baratieri if he didn't advance, Baratieri finally deciding that a disastrous offensive was preferable to certain recall and disgrace. It is a pattern we see throughout colonial history. Imperial capitals demanding quick victories from commanders who understand local realities, political pressures overriding military judgment, the gap between colonial fantasy and colonial fact becoming unbridgeable until it explodes into catastrophe. So, on February 29, 1896, Baratieri gave the order that would doom his army: advance towards Adwa and destroy Menelik's forces before they could fully concentrate. The battle itself unfolded like a masterclass in tactical coordination that would have impressed European military academies, if they had been willing to admit that Africans could conduct sophisticated military operations. The terrain around Adwa is a series of interconnected valleys and ridges where the mountains create natural choke points and the high altitude makes every movement exhausting for troops not adapted to the conditions. Baratieri's plan followed textbook European doctrine: advance in 3 separate columns, converge on the enemy position, crush opposition through superior discipline and firepower. What actually happened was a demonstration of why local knowledge trumps technological superiority when the locals are properly organized and the foreigners are operating beyond their limits. Ethiopian forces used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to fragment the Italian advance, attacking each column before it could support the other. Italian communications broke down completely. Officers couldn't coordinate between units, couldn't call for support, couldn't even figure out where they were on their increasingly useless European maps. Here's the detail that captures the psychological dimension of what was happening. The Italian army's African auxiliaries, recruited from the ethnic groups traditionally hostile to Ethiopian rule, began deserting en masse when they realized that the tide of the battle was turning. These weren't mercenaries motivated purely by pay. These were people who had to live in this region after the Europeans went home and they could read the writing on the mountain walls. The Italian retreat began around midday, but retreat became rout, and rout became massacre. Ethiopian forces, fighting on terrain they knew intimately, pursued fleeing Italian columns through mountain passes that became killing grounds. By sunset, Italian casualties were catastrophic. Nearly 7,000 Italian soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured, about 40% of their entire force. Among the dead was General Albertone, commander of the Italian brigade that bore the brunt of the initial assault. Among the captured were over 3,000 soldiers who would spend years in Ethiopian captivity. Ethiopian casualties were significant, but proportionately much smaller, maybe 7,000 dead and wounded out of 100,000 engaged. More importantly, Italy's credibility as a colonial power lay in ruins on the mountain slopes around Adwa. But the real victory wasn't military, it was psychological. News of Adwa traveled across Africa faster than any telegraph system carried by traders, pilgrims, or any kind of informal network that European colonial administrators never understood. From Cape Town to Cairo, from Lagos to Zanzibar, Africans learned that European armies could be defeated, that African military organization could triumph over European technology, and that colonial domination is not inevitable. For Ethiopia itself, Adwa created something unprecedented in African history: a national identity forged in successful resistance to European colonialism. This wasn't just a military victory, it was a proof of concept. Proof that African societies could engage with modernity on their own terms and could adopt new technologies without surrendering independence. Every subsequent generation of Ethiopian leader would invoke Adwa as evidence that Ethiopia was different, special, chosen by history to remain free. The psychological confidence became a kind of national DNA, influencing everything from diplomatic strategy to internal governance. Menelik understood the magnitude of what had just happened. In his communications with European powers after Adwa, he didn't gloat or threaten. Instead, he positioned Ethiopia as a sovereign nation that had simply defended itself against unprovoked aggression. Exactly the language that European international law claimed to respect. This wasn't accidental. Menelik knew that military victory meant nothing without diplomatic recognition, so he spent the years after Adwa carefully cultivating relationships with European powers, demonstrating that Ethiopia could play by international rules while maintaining its independence. But Adwa also created a burden that would shape Ethiopian history for the next century. The victory established expectations of Ethiopian exceptionalism that would influence, and sometimes distort, Ethiopian responses to every subsequent crisis. The psychological confidence that came from defeating a European army became both Ethiopia's greatest strength and its most dangerous vulnerability. When we talk about Ethiopia's fierce independence today, when we see their resistance to outside pressure, when we watch them play leadership roles in African organizations, all of that traces back to March 1st, 1896, when Emperor Menelik II proved that the European conquest of Africa was not inevitable. The mountains around Adwa are quiet now, dotted with monuments where tourists come to photograph Italian cannons abandoned on the battlefield. The psychological landscape that battle creates still shapes how Ethiopians see themselves and how the world sees Ethiopia. In 6 hours of fighting, Menelik II didn't just win a military victory. He created a template for African resistance that would inspire independence movements from Ghana to Algeria to Zimbabwe. He proved that African states could engage with the modern world on their own terms. And he established the psychological foundation for what would become the Organization of African Unity, continental institutions headquartered in Addis Ababa, partly because Ethiopia had never truly lost its independence. But surviving independence was only the beginning of Ethiopia's challenge. Because proving you can defeat European colonialism is one thing, proving you can build a modern African state while maintaining traditional Ethiopian identity, it's an entirely different kind of battle, and one that would test every generation of Ethiopian leaders for centuries to come. Next time, on Double Helix, we'll witness how Adwa's victory created an impossible burden. The expectation that Ethiopia could modernize while remaining authentically Ethiopian, could engage with the international community while preserving its fierce independence. We'll follow Emperor Haile Selassie as he tries to balance ancient traditions with modern institutions, Orthodox Christianity with secular governance, Ethiopian pride with diplomatic necessity, and we'll see how that delicate balance would be tested when Mussolini's fascist war machine returned to finish what Italy had started in 1896. This time, with poison gas and a determination to erase Ethiopian independence forever. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.